Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We should say in advance that we have electricity scheduled to come back on in half an hour. We've been assured that that will not affect our internet connection because two of us are using the same venue. But if it does, please bear with us. We'll be back as soon as possible. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. This is the first ever insiders only event. So we're absolutely thrilled to be trialing this and to have so many of you with us. We owe you a great deal. As the staff of Daily Maverick, we're very, very conscious of that. You are the ones who really keep the lights on around here as much as you can, with Eskom at the helm. With me tonight is Daily Maverick's own Scorpio star, Pauli van Wyk, who needs no introduction for many of you, and our sister, so to speak, our sister body, amaBhungane's Susan Comrie. amaBhungane is, of course, one of the most critical institutions in this country when it comes to truth-telling and holding politicians to account. And we really would like to encourage you to also consider donating to amaBhungane. We work very closely with them, and a donation for them is very much a donation to all of us in the media sector. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the age of accountability, which perhaps is a bit of an optimistic or lofty title for what's happening in the political landscape. But for those of us who are constantly scanning the terrain for signs that the political tide is turning against corruption, there have been some green shoots of late. We have seen the paying back of the money by McKinsey to Transnet and Eskom. We have seen the likes of Iqbal Sharma make court appearances. We've seen Interpol asked to assist with the Guptas, and we've seen the UAE finally sign, though not ratify, an extradition treaty for the Guptas. And these are all arguably positive signs, though perhaps not as concrete as we might hope. But what we're here to do tonight, primarily, at least initially, is to discuss the work that led to McKinsey agreeing to pay back the money, which was carried out in large part by Pauli and by Susan, and to discuss the meaning of this gesture when it comes to both the political landscape and to the corporate world in South Africa. First of all, thank you very much, Susan and Pauli, for being with us today.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Cool. Okay, let's start with this. What led us to the place where McKinsey, one of the world's most prestigious and reputable management consultancy firms, is paying back money to the South African government? Pauli, will you kick us off?
Yeah, well, it's a confluence of good journalism, whistleblowers, and a public willing to listen, and also an era in South Africa.
Defense had McKinsey committed that led them to have to repay this money?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, look, from McKinsey's perspective, they seem to be paying back the money essentially for reputational reasons. It's not like someone has forced them to pay back the money at this stage. Sorry about the dogs. But there's certainly an anticipation that with further investigation that one may discover that there is a crime lying underneath their actions. It's important to remember that so far, the version of events that we've heard is largely a kind of McKinsey version that's been unmediated by the NPA or the Hawks or anything like that. You've heard what journalists have said, because journalists have done a lot of the work of uncovering that. But we still have a very sort of limited access to the kind of millions of emails that are sitting on the McKinsey servers. We don't have access, for instance, to the kind of confidential reports that McKinsey produced in-house that supposedly said that they did nothing wrong. I think once we do get access to that, or once the authorities get access to that, we might get a very different picture to the one that McKinsey has kind of put out into the public domain.
Absolutely. Yeah, Pauli, will you take us through some of the reporting that you and Susan did on this and where that came from?
Absolutely. So just on that, when we talk about criminality or unlawful behavior or illegality, we talk obviously about intent, which is what Susan was just alluding to. So if you want to prove, or let me say it in this way, the elements of a crime often turns on intent. So what you will have to look out for is what was McKinsey's intent with working with the Guptas? Did they know about, and that is why McKinsey is strongly coming out from the start saying that they didn't know that the Guptas were involved, which is obviously leading us then to say, okay, but what happened to your due diligence? How did you not know that you were working with people that used you as a Trojan horse? So much of the questions and the acts that we will describe in this webinar will turn on intent. The same with Eskom and Transnet. Eskom and Transnet, however, is a different kettle of fish because we have the PFMA, we have the Companies Act, we have a series of acts in South Africa where that they did breach and where the problem really did sort of boil down to illegal and criminal behavior. But if we speak about, again, the investigations that we've done, it was mainly to point out that McKinsey allowed itself to be used as a Trojan horse by the Guptas. It was used by Trillion and Regiments, two different companies, with the eye on getting billions from Transnet and Eskom. And obviously, as Susan proved later and looked at SA as well, work with all sorts of SOEs, including SARS. And while at the back, the Guptas would be manipulating the contracts. So that is why you'll see Regiments, on the one hand, involved in Transnet and Trillion in Eskom. So back then, Regiments was one of these companies that the Guptas tried to take over, if you will. So the owners at the time weren't very keen on what they saw as a relatively hostile takeover. And that caused the company to split in two. One director, which is named Eric Wood, and a team he took and created Trillion. And that is sort of the scene setter for what we have found out, is that in essence, the Guptas, through these two companies, were the kingmakers in Eskom and Transnet. Their aides in these SOEs were especially Anosh Singh and Brian Molefe and some of their underlings, an entire network of people that made the deals happen and signed off on contracts and paid. Literally, Susan and I wrote a story in the McKinsey dossier where we literally found out how Eskom's payment system was broken and breached to get Trillion loaded on that system. So yeah, the illegalities were numerous.
There's been a lot spoken about the role of consultants in state capture. Susan, can you talk a bit to that, to what ostensible purpose these consultants were brought on to do and whether it was in any way necessary?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating story if one looks back at Transnet. So you have, Transnet deciding in around 2012 that they're going to go on this, massive expansion plan. And McKinsey gets involved very early on to write the kind of business case to say you can afford to massively expand, to go out and buy all of these locomotives, because look at all of the volumes that you could get if you get these new locomotives. It's field of dreams stuff. If you build the locomotives, then the business will come. The business will move back onto the railway line. So McKinsey gets involved very early on there. But it becomes quite apparent once the locomotives are bought that the volumes are not materializing. The sort of large shipping of manganese, general freight business, this is just not, it's just not materializing. So then the consultants get hired again. So they get brought in and they get asked to do this consulting work to try and increase the volumes, to try and get to those figures that were needed in order to justify this contract in the first place. When you go across to Eskom, you have the consultants coming in again, and there's, again, this kind of ironic situation going on where you have consultants being brought in to help Eskom to cut costs. But the way that they do that is by billing Eskom, each different revenue stream from each different department in Eskom, and given a breakdown of how much they thought they could make. And the figure that they ultimately got to was like 9.4 billion or something. Now, we asked McKinsey about that, and they had said that it was, I forget the word exactly that they'd used, but they said it was essentially kind of provisional. It was it was kind of early tinkering around. But it's insane that you have companies. Now, McKinsey, as we know, has been at Eskom for 10 years. They've been there for, forever. They know Eskom. They know that Eskom cannot afford 9.4 billion rand in fees.
Yeah.
And yet they're willing to sit there with Trillian and say, this is how much money we think we can take. So, in both SOEs, you have this kind of idea that the consultants will come in and they will, they'll either increase sales or they'll be able to make these impressive cuts to the bottom line. And I think if one looks at both of those SOEs, it's pretty clear that the consulting work, although there was a lot of work done, although some of it was very good, I don't think that those results materialized.
Mm. Pauli, a difficult question perhaps, but if we're looking at where we are today, literally today, we're in stage 3 or stage 4 load shedding. How direct a line can we draw between the behavior of private sector firms like McKinsey and the problems that Eskom, for instance, faces at this moment?
I think you can draw a direct line. That is exactly where the problem is. And we've not only seen it in Transnet and Eskom and with McKinsey, we've seen it in SARS with Bain & Company, we've seen it in Denel, we've seen it in SAA, we've seen it with legal firms. It's not only consulting firms. So the private, we cannot, I think it's very popular to make government out as the big bullies and the big wrongdoers in South Africa. But we are not thoughtfully thinking about the role of the private sector and big business in what we're doing. Look at what Bell Pottinger did in South Africa, and they were an international firm as well. So, right to zone into your question, the money being paid from Eskom and Transnet to McKinsey is already a massive problem. Is already a problem in a time when they were cash strapped. But now you're looking at breaking systems inside Eskom and Transnet, and and sort of putting in people in places where they shouldn't be and that they're not qualified for, but they will be the people to sign off on contracts and deals. So I think it's a two-pronged answer. It's on the one hand, it literally is the money that's flowing out, but it's also on the second hand, the breaking of systems, the people injected there that shouldn't be there, and the ripple effect of the people being in there and the decisions they make, apart from McKinsey and Trillian and regiments, that really got us to where we are.
Thank you to all of you. Sorry, Susan.
Charge in the public sector. McKinsey ripped that up with their at-risk consulting contract. And the problem is that when other firms saw what McKinsey was doing, because everyone knew what was happening, everyone knew, what was going on at Eskom, there seems to have kind of been this feeling of, well, if McKinsey's doing it, we're going to do it as well. So one has to look at the contracts that followed McKinsey, that kind of picked up where McKinsey left off. Deloitte, PwC, KPMG as well. All of those big firms came in as soon as the McKinsey contract went out the window, essentially to pick up where McKinsey had left off. And conveniently, all of those firms end up partnering with Nkonki, which at the time, that was when Salim Efsa was effectively transferring his interest from Trillian into Nkonki. It's one of the great ironies that the money that gets stolen from Eskom by Trillian in the Eskom contract ends up being used to help buy this covert stake in Nkonki, which then makes Nkonki the new Trillian, the new vehicle, which then partners with all of these different firms. So it really kind of, that sort of imagery of them being the Trojan horse is so important. As much as Regiments was the kind of Trojan horse for the Guptas, McKinsey was really the Trojan horse that carried all of them into state-owned entities. And that when they left, it was just kind of the gates were broken open. And we really saw a kind of, some pretty egregious behavior by consultants.
That's a really important point. Thank you, Susan. I just want to say hi to those of you who joined us a little bit late, and to say thank you again for you Daily Maverick insiders and all you do to help us defend truth. Please do not hesitate to leave comments in the chat and questions for Pauli and Susan, and we'll definitely get to them as we go along. Now, I want to ask you something which has been debated a bit in the press by the likes of Open Secrets, etc., and that is, how far does the McKinsey gesture go? What does it ultimately mean, and is it enough? We're talking about paying back 1.87 billion. To the layman, that might seem like an extraordinarily large quantum. Pauli, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm very irritated by people that say, it's so large, it's so much money. I'm sitting here in the dark, not in my home, because of Eskom and because of McKinsey. I think the preparations, not only the money that they paid physically out of their pocket, but how do you quantify, Rebecca? How do you quantify the fact that Anosh Singh and Brian Molefe was injected into Eskom to help the Guptas grab a hold of the purse? And how do you get back that innocence of someone who said she was bullied to break the system to add this Gupta related company on the Eskom system while she knew she was committing a crime? How do you quantify, how do you monetize that value, and then tell me how much they should pay back?
Your take, Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, there's the money and then there's accountability. And I think we need to be very clear that those are two very, very separate things. Great that they've paid back the fees. That saves us having to go to court to ask for that money back. But there is so much work still to do to really get accountability from McKinsey. We still have, we have McKinsey's version of what happened. And there are so many holes in that version of events. We really need, whether it's the Zondo Commission, the NPA, or whether it's the US DOJ, we really need them to force a lot of information into the public domain. And I'll give you an example of just one thing. McKinsey kind of has always kept up this drumbeat of, we didn't partner with Trillion, we didn't know what we were getting into. I was looking a little bit earlier at some of the documents that Pauli and I had worked from back on our, when we did the McKinsey dossier series. One of them was a kind of presentation which had a slide summarizing the potential risks that they faced. Now, this was a slide they had put together in January of 2016, so right at the beginning of this contract. And they openly identify that one of the risks that they face is that information about this project is going to be leaked to the public, and that there's going to be outrage about the exorbitant fees and outrage about how the contract was handed to McKinsey. They also say in there, one of the big risks that they face is a reputational risk of partnering with Trillion. Now, this is a company which supposedly they had no idea who they were. The thing is that McKinsey has identified very early on in those meetings. Now, you can see from that particular slide that it says the source of the information is McKinsey risk committees. So you have McKinsey risk committees. And from what I understand, that could well be McKinsey risk committees at a global level, sitting there right at the beginning of this contract, the Eskom contract at least, sitting there and saying, we could get into a lot of trouble over this contract, and we could get into reputational trouble because we're partnering with Trillion. We could get into, problems because people might realize that, that the fees are exorbitant, that this contract is being placed in an unusual or irregular way. So, when we talk about accountability, those are the kinds of documents that we need to see. We need to see those coming into the public domain. What did McKinsey at a global level know at Eskom? That's really the big question for me. And I think there's a long way to go before we get a clear answer on that. And I don't think in any way that we should kind of let McKinsey off the hook simply because they've taken the first step of paying back the fees.
Yeah. There was a question submitted earlier from an insider who wants to know whether McKinsey was now banned from doing any government work, or whether that should be the case.
I don't think so. Not that I know.
Not so far I know. I know that they've been involved in some consulting capacity in small contracts, and maybe they should. Maybe it's a good repercussion for South Africa that and for McKinsey, and obviously a learning curve for other consulting and legal firms. That if you come here and if you are corrupt or if you are caught in participating in wrongdoing, this is what will happen. Now, if we talk about legal repercussions, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States can prosecute McKinsey and officials involved here in these contracts for being willfully blind to corruption. So that is something that, but again, you need access to their emails, you need access to their communication, and some of the, as Susan just said, the real discussion documents about these contracts beforehand. What we do know, however, from Eskom's side specifically, is that their lawyers warned them beforehand that it would be probably an illegal contract to sign with McKinsey. And we also know from McKinsey's side that they said it would take a brave Eskom to sign this contract. I think it takes us a long way down the road of saying there was a lot of wrongdoing here.
I want to take you both a little wider now. One of the comments made by the Deputy Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, recently at the inquiry into state capture was that it was at the Zondo Commission that McKinsey pledged to pay back one of the sums of money, I think it was to Transnet. Judge Zondo said that this is evidence to the naysayers that the Zondo Commission is working because this provided a kind of platform of shaming or, accountability that made McKinsey, that gave them the nudge to promise to pay back the money. What is your view on this? Is the Zondo Commission working as effectively as one might hope?
I think there are layers of accountability. And when you look at how accountability is meted out, you have to think about all these layers. One of them, and maybe the most important one for South Africa, at least at the moment, is public knowledge about what happened. Because remember, beforehand, it was Susan and I telling people, you don't know us. We want you to believe us. And here are some documents and we've analyzed it for you. And these are all the wrongdoing that we found, right? But now people could see Anosh Singh testify, Brian Molefe testify, people, lying, being caught out, being under cross-examination. And a commission of inquiry is always, it's a recommendational body, right? It doesn't find anyone guilty. It can't, it's that one official, but you are a chartered accountant. He repeated it 3 times. Not even he could understand that someone could give him these nonsensical, stupid answers. And she's a chartered accountant. So, clearly, I think there's a lot of accountability to go for. We need people to go to jail. We need people to answer in court. We need more money paid back. We need government policies to be strengthened again and people injected into positions that they're qualified for. And I think that first layer, in terms of the Zondo Commission, really did help. And I think it's always the first step of a country rectifying itself when the public fabric starts to realize what's happening. And then obviously the money being paid back to and public naming and shaming on an international stage. Because remember, there's still that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US and they don't play.
They don't play. Susan, I'm curious to get your take on that too, on the Zondo Commission's efficacy or lack thereof.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we really needed it at that moment. And it's been an incredibly cathartic thing for the country to go through this process. I remember sitting and watching Riyad Desai's documentary, How to Steal a Country, which kind of looked back at our Gupta Leaks reporting. And you guys will remember because you were part of this whole Gupta Leaks team. But the kind of level of heightened anxiety that the country was under, the kind of level of pressure of where we were, is so noticeably different to where we are now. And I think the Zondo Commission has played a huge role in just allowing us as a country to kind of there's a lot of problems with the New Dawn, but it was a really important process for us. There's also, for us as journalists, there's amazing information that's come out of the Zondo Commission. We spent years being told, you don't know what you're talking about. Your sources are lying. You just don't understand the figures. You don't understand the documents. Just being told you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. So for us, it's been this amazing process of kind of confirming, wait, you weren't crazy. There was all of this stuff going on. At the same time, it's also been, I think if you look at someone like, if you look at EOH, for instance, EOH had, they had done this whole internal investigation. They'd said they had found evidence of corruption, but none of that was coming out into the public domain. They had filed Section 34s with the Hawks, and that's kind of effectively as far as the cases had got. But what was important is when they had the Zondo Commission, you've seen that with, for instance, Standard Bank when they've testified and they brought just like reams of bank statements. You know, the kinds of things that as journalists we love to get, but you know, we don't have the legal right to go and do that. So we rely on people kind of leaking us a page here and there. They were suddenly putting huge amounts of information out there. You know, that information, it may not be apparent right now, but that information exposes international money laundering networks. It exposes corruption in all different directions, not just what the commission's looking at. Because once you start cracking into kind of commercial money laundering networks, what you find is evidence of a whole lot of different crimes. You find all kinds of people who've been using these networks. So I think the long-term impact in terms of that, it may not necessarily be immediately apparent. And, you know, there have been a lot of problems with the commission of how it's been run and what it's focused on. But I think there's real value. There's real long-term value in what's been brought into the light because of the commission being there as a mechanism to allow this information suddenly to flow out.
Mm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. Pauli, sometimes something we hear a lot, and I'm sure you hear especially a lot, is why is it that so much of this information, especially as Susan says, thanks to the Zondo Commission, is now in the public domain. It's also in the public domain thanks to the work of investigative journalists. And yet there appears to be so little action on the part of the NPA and the investigative directorate. What is your read on what's happening there behind the scenes?
Yeah, we need to remember it was 10 years in the making of decimating the investigative capacity of the Hawks and the prosecuting authority. They were, well, it was first the State Security Agency that the Zuma era attacked, and when they were under the thumb, they went straight for the NPA and the Hawks and, the Scorpions, and then the Hawks and crime intelligence. So we are sitting with 10 years, with more than a decade of rot that we most definitely cannot think will be rectified in 3 years of fake new dawn, as we are implying. So I think they're trying, and I know a lot of them personally, and they are really good people. They are really sharp, and they're patriots. They want to do the right thing. But on the one hand, the structural problems inside the Hawks and the prosecuting authority is so big. For example, this is something that we haven't written about because it doesn't make good headlines, but it's one of the main problems, I think, in the Zondo/NPA working together is, yes, we have this proclamation that the Zondo evidence can be used by the prosecuting authority and the Hawks, but no one has written the protocol to actually facilitate handing over the reams of bank statements and documents to the Hawks and then to the prosecuting authority so that it will stand up as a chain of evidence in court. Now, those things are important, and that make or breaks a investigation and a cross-examination in front of a court, that chain of evidence. So often it's not that the people are corrupt, it's that the system is not working. And that system, you first need someone realizing that the system isn't working, then you need someone to write the system or the policy.
I wouldn't want to kind of suggest that I know the intricate difficulties that they have. I do think that there are a lot of cases that need to be filed, particularly, you know, if you go and use the kind of special tribunal route to reclaim money, you know, that's a quick way of kind of targeting the companies who need to pay back the money. And, you know, there's been some interesting cases filed there. If one looks at, I saw one of the questions was about SAP, the software company. Yeah. You know, that's a company that needs to pay back the money tomorrow, but that is essentially kind of giving, you know, all of us the middle finger and continuing to get billions of rands worth of money out of the country. So I think there are definitely cases that it kind of, I don't really understand why the NPA is taking so long to get to them. Cases that certainly feel like there's some low-hanging fruit there. But I think, you know, as Pauli quite correctly pointed out, there was a 10-year project to break the NPA. Building it overnight is by no means an easy job.
Yeah, I'm very conscious that we've got questions stacking up from our lovely insiders, but I just want to get through a few more with you two before I hand over. Pauli, a question in your kind of wagon specifically, and that is about VBS. We've just seen Brian Shivambu quietly pay back VBS money. Brian Shivambu, of course, being the cousin of the better-known Floyd. How far are we towards accountability in that particular saga, the VBS saga?
Well, Brian is his brother.
Brother, I apologize, sorry.
But the cousins are also involved, so you're not far off. It's a family affair, Rebecca. Sure, prosecutions and real accountability. So accountability, again, is a layered affair, as we said. We have some of the money back in terms of specifically this Shivambus and the Malemas. We have a lot of the money back relating to all the other crooks in the VBS saga, like the Matotsis and Shafiwa Matotsi was the chair, the lawyers, the auditors. So some of their companies were liquidated and sequestrated. So we have clawed back the money that we can so far from the top level or layer of people involved. 15 of them are already in court. One pleaded guilty. He was the CFO of the bank, Philip Tritter, and he will be testifying against 14 of the others. So one politician that I wrote about, Daniel Caesar, linked to the ANC in Limpopo. He was the leader there. Kabelo Matsepe, who is also an ANC-linked businessman. They are also in the dock and need to stand or to explain accusations of corruption and money laundering and all sorts of nefarious things. Relating to the Shivambus and the Malema specifically, while we are waiting for the SARS and the Hawks and the prosecuting authority to do their work, when I see Malema attacking the judges and attacking SARS, it seems as if he's had a few calls already, definitely also from the banks. It seems as if the banks have started to ask questions about their numerous bank accounts and about the laundering of money in those bank accounts, because he's also been attacking the banks recently.
Right, yeah, telling that. I want to talk about the Guptas quickly, the Guptas themselves, who are always the kind of absent to be about this matter of extradition, the Guptas. How hopeful should we be, do you think, about seeing them in court soon? And Susan, perhaps for you, if they do end up in a South African court, how strong do you think the evidence is against the brothers?
Sure, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think, if one looks at a lot of the evidence we have seen, one sees Salim S's fingerprints all over, all over this. If you look at for instance, the McKinsey regiments contracts, the McKinsey trillion contracts, what you see, particularly with McKinsey and regiments and their work at Transnet, is you see money flowing into these what we call letterbox companies, which are essentially companies that exist on paper. The address is normally fake. The director is often someone who has handed over their ID book, signed a few pages, and they have no real control over the company. But you see Salim S's fingerprints all over that side of things. So, and we have always taken the view that where Salim Essa is, he is essentially acting not just for himself, but for the Gupta brothers as well. I think in order to, we have some pretty fantastic laws in terms of being able to prove a conspiracy, where you can say all of these people, you didn't necessarily need to be the person handing over the envelope of money. You are part of a conspiracy, part of, build a racketeering case by drawing people into that. I think if one is saying, show me the evidence of Atul Gupta, directing exactly how a contract should be determined, well, there probably is that evidence out there. I don't know if we'll be able to find it. There's been a lot of evidence destroyed. But when one steps back, looks at the bigger picture of the system that they built, I think there is a very strong case that can be made that all of these characters can be prosecuted under racketeering charges, that they were all part of a concerted effort, and each kind of character plays their different role. Someone like Salim Essa had a more hands-on day-to-day kind of job that he played. The Gupta brothers would have played a more kind of political strategic role. So I think when one puts that all together, though, then there is a really convincing case. What's interesting, though, I think, is that you need to get some of the lieutenants, people like Ashok Narayan, people like Iqbal Sharma, who had played this kind of key role, whose hands might be a little bit dirtier. Once you get them, then I think you unlock the whole empire.
Right. So you'll need someone to flip, and that's a question coming from one of our insiders. Do you think there's any chance that someone like Iqbal Sharma could spill the proverbial?
And then often you will see these people turn. Just to add what Susan said is I also investigated a lot about the Gupta's involvement in SARS with a VAT scam they tried to ensure or to manage there with Tomiani, and Ronika Raghavan was there the key point person. So it was very clear that they had these. They were the brothers sort of were on top, and they were manipulating and pulling the strings. They had these lieutenants like Ronika Raghavan, Salim Essa, and then they had the pawns like Anosh Singh and Brian Molefe and Iqbal Sharma and those people that made the things happen on a government level, and they were especially bought. Now, if you start turning some of those pawns and one or two lieutenants who can tell you or explain to you how a part or maybe the entire network works, you can start building this racketeering case that Susan refers to. But it takes work and it takes a lot of investigation. Just shame. So also, in fairness to our Hawks and the NPA, we are talking in 5 sentences about how you can wrap up an entire racketeering structure. But every word is underlaid here by subpoenas, for example, relating to cell phones and cell phone towers and banks and bank statements and documents. And all of those are hours and hours and hours of work. So sometimes it's also just a massive job.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's hit some of these insider questions. And thank you. That last question was from Lisa Wilson about Iqbal Sharma. Megan Petzer and a few other people actually have asked a more personal question, which is, as investigative journalists, are you afraid? Is there reason for you to be fearful? Susan, you mentioned that you feel like the atmosphere has changed. Perhaps that's germane to this.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. I often think that, you know, journalists like me and like Pauli, when we're reporting about kind of high-level, state-level corruption, sometimes I don't think, although there's this kind of idea that that must be the most dangerous kind of reporting to do, I don't think that's actually true. The journalists who I worry most about are the journalists who are reporting on municipal level corruption.
Right.
That's where things get really dangerous, really for journalists. And I think we've seen that in terms of journalists who've been attacked, journalists who've been murdered, that kind of thing. I think, for us, the kind of the Gupta leaks and the lead up to the Gupta leaks coming out, that was a scary time, because we just didn't know. We didn't know what the capabilities of the state were, and we didn't know what would happen if anyone found out that we had that information. After the information came out, though, I think we all kind of just breathed a sigh of relief and said, okay, well, we're now a bit safer. But it was really eye-opening for me, seeing some of the witnesses come to the commission. For instance, Brian Curran, who had been the kind of custodian of the hard drive, because you're not necessarily going to get a warning if you're in danger. You wouldn't necessarily know. Often the people who are going to come and bluster and threaten you are actually not the most dangerous people. So I think you always have to take the view of being cautious, and assuming that you're not necessarily going to get an anonymous letter warning you to cease and desist or else.
Pauli, you in particular have been the target on social media lately of an astonishing amount of vitriol, aimed mainly, I think, at your reporting on EFF-related corruption. Do you feel anxious about those levels of threats?
I think our editor felt much more anxious about me than I felt. I think my anxiety resides with my sources' welfare. The whistleblowers really are in a load of danger, and I worry about them constantly. And I focus my energy on keeping them safe, because you can always off a journalist, but that's not your main problem. Your main problem is the leak if you're the criminal. So you would rather, in different ways, start to attack and scare and bully and kill the people leaking information to the journalists. And it's always, I know Susan as well, she focuses on keeping her sources extremely safe. It's something that I learned from amaBhungane many years ago. So that would be my main worry. Branko did at one stage tell me, don't you think you need bodyguards? Don't you think you need to keep yourself safe? And at one stage he did ensure that I didn't sort of live in the same space for 2 weeks at a time. And that's, I think when your parents are angsty on your behalf, that drives up all your own angst. But no, fortunately, I myself also understand that, the EFF are different in a way that they attack your credibility. They wouldn't have bothered if they were trying to off me, I think. So, and that is even more dangerous, because their tactic at the moment is, and for the past 3 years, was if no one believes her, it doesn't matter what she says. And if someone believes she's racist and she's, sent by white monopoly capital, or if we dehumanize her by calling her a witch, it's much more easier to call her dehumanizing things, saying that she must be raped and hanged and burned, or to ensure that no one takes them seriously if journalists aren't believable. So that is a tactic that I worry much more about. Fortunately, I did report on crime for a long time in my career early on, and there I learned basic techniques to keep myself safe, to operate in a dangerous environment, and to ensure that I'm not followed or not pickpocketed or whatever. So that also comes in handy, and I think you start doing that as a second nature.
So speaking of keeping whistleblowers in safety or not, I've received a message from a colleague suggesting that I ask you to tell the story for our listeners of Lady Macbeth, who is kind of the villain of the Gupta leaks story. And that's a tale that hasn't really been told before, but it is all out in the open now. I don't know if either of you would like to take that one.
I'll leave that one to Pauli. I'm sure she's got more detail than me.
Well, so the broad strokes is that we received the Gupta leaks. It was given to Branko Brikic, our editor, and Branko obviously realized immediately that this is so big that he cannot keep it to his own team. He realized that we needed a bigger team, that we needed amaBhungane's expertise, and he immediately invited them to be part of this larger team that would work on the Gupta leaks. The second problem was that we needed funding, because we are poor and money is hard to come by as journalists. So he started reaching out to people he thought were friends in that regard, friends meaning benefactors, and friends meaning people who view the Constitution and how sacred it is and how sacred journalism is in the same way we did, or we still do. And that backfired spectacularly with one person that he gave a small amount of information of, because he told her, if you give time, and that is the problem when people who knows nothing about politics try to play politics. At the time, there was an NEC meeting of the ANC, and it was literally the building up of getting President Zuma out of the ANC. But anyone who knew the politics of the moment and who knew the politics of the time did realize that Zuma wouldn't be ousted right then and there at that weekend. It was just one more step in the broader spectrum of things that needed to be done. So anyway, she thought she's going to influence politics and she's going to get the ANC to kick him out over that weekend. And she leaked the documents that Branko gave to her in confidence to one of our competitors via a political intermediary. And it was published. And apart from that, it was like 10 stories condensed in one, which is disastrous and really bad for any effective journalism. She didn't care that she put our whistleblowers' lives in danger. And for that, we call her Lady Macbeth, because she very, very almost caused the death of very important people in the history in the country, our country's history.
Well, there you have it, insiders. If you have nothing else to take away from tonight, that is a bit of dinner party gossip for you, that it was Magda who almost scuppered the Gupta leaks. Sorry, Susan, you were going to add something.
No, I was just going to say, the way that we kind of found out about it was a contact of mine had asked me a question about the Guptas, and I had, I'd kind of said, why are you interested in this? And eventually I kind of, I had to haul off to Melville on a Saturday night to go and have a drink with this person who then let slip, oh, by the way, there's a big thing coming tomorrow in the Sunday Times, and this is what it is. And kind of had to scuttle off to the bathroom very quickly and be like, quick, like it's leaking. But, the serious ones kind of working with these whistleblowers, building trust, convincing them to effectively put their lives, their futures and everything into our hands. And then to have to tell them on a Saturday night at 11 p.m., sorry, this is coming. And it's coming, the papers are hitting the streets literally as we speak. It's for the sake of playing politics, it put a lot of people in extreme danger.
And a lot of kids, because those whistleblowers have families. It was a very hectic time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to make light of it. It was a horrific ethical breach. And I think, we experienced it as deeply distressing, almost traumatic at the time. Let's try and clap a few more of these questions before we go. There's been quite a few questions about consultants, actually. When did it become, to your knowledge, common practice for governments and private sector to rely so heavily on the use of consultants? Is it a relatively modern phenomenon in your view? I'm not sure of the answer to that.
Yeah, well, Susan will also know from her perspective and broader investigations, but certainly from mine. So it was part of the larger state capture project because Eskom, for example, had its own very, very good financial team that was supposed to do all these things that they got the consultants to do. And if you break that team by design and by thinking that you can make a lot of money by paying a consultant and then skimming from the top of their fees, then this is what you will get.
A question which I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, but let's give it a bash, is who is in charge of looking after the money that's being paid back? Do we have any guarantees that money is not going to be stolen? Role have our banks played in allowing these funds to disappear internationally? It's a big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a massive issue, and internationally so too. We can just quickly Google HSBC and money laundering to get all the info on that. One of the international banks, an American bank, which I can't remember now, also imploded because of the same thing. Locally, definitely. So Susan had a fantastic investigation on, was it Nedbank, Susan? I hope I'm not fingering the wrong bank. Yeah.
No, it wasn't the same. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and she can tell you more about that. But we can see from the Gupta leaks and from my own investigations into SARS and Denel and Eskom that, and now with the Malemas and Shivambus as well, is that, these money flows shouldn't just happen like that, but it does. It is facilitated most definitely by the banks.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, when one looks at, there've been a couple of SARB FIC reports that have leaked thanks to the Zondo Commission that have been put into the public domain. Normally these are documents that we never get anywhere near. It's incredibly secretive organization. But it's essentially, you know, the organization that's watching the money flows, that's watching the money come into and out of the country. And what's so telling for me is that they catch such a small amount of what goes. You know, if they catch 10% of what one particular laundry vehicle is moving in and out, that's great for them. I think normally they catch, you know, just an absolutely minuscule amount. And the problem is that when one laundry vehicle gets shut down, another one comes right back up. I think one of the key banks for me was the Bank of Baroda. You know, it kind of gets into slightly technical detail, but one of the really effective money laundering tricks that the Guptas used was a loan back scheme, essentially where you place money in a bank account in one country, and then you use that money, that bank account, as collateral to take a loan in another country. And then that loan never gets paid back, and eventually the loan from overseas comes and is used for that. It breaks the money laundering chain. It makes money laundering incredibly difficult to investigate. But the Bank of Baroda, the Guptas were doing it constantly through the Bank of Baroda. And it was a huge problem that they didn't identify what was happening. I mean, these are banks. This is their business. They should be aware that when you have one person making a loan and then using that loan as collateral against a completely different person's loan in a different country, sure, that could happen once or twice. Surely when it happens constantly and it's the same group of clients, surely that's a big red flag for you. Again, HSBC, I mean, I think they could be in a lot of trouble because they've been caught before with money laundering for, I think it was some of the Mexican cartels, if I recall correctly. So, you know, particularly the banks that have helped in the process of moving money offshore have a lot to answer for.
Okay, guys, we are desperately short of time, so I'd like to wrap up with one final question to both of you, and that is, are we in an age of accountability? Is it hopelessly naive to say that accountability is upon us? Pauli, you referred to the fake new dawn earlier. Someone wanted to also to question that. That suggests you feel a little cynical about it.
I don't believe politicians that easily. If you look at the slashing of the NPA and Hawks' budget, if you look at what Gwede Mantashe is doing with car powership deals that amaBhungane and Daily Maverick has been written diligently about, if you look at his health minister, Mkhize, but we can't think, okay, we're turning it around and now we're stopping. That is not how we are sort of on the cusp of trying to attempt to do it and make it better.
I'll take it. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a list. If you want accountability, there's a list of companies who need to start paying back money and start disclosing exactly what happened. So let me give you my list. SAP, the software company, they had promised us in 2018 that they were going to review all their public sector contracts, would report back within 6 months, and that they would disclose all of the business development partners that they had been paying on those contracts. They're no longer honoring that commitment. That was in 2018. They should have disclosed that in October. They are still getting billions of rands from government. They need to pay back the money. Next company, Liebherr, the German crane company, they need to pay back. Neotel as well. That was one of the first investigations. The first letterbox companies that amaBhungane exposed was a Neotel deal with Transnet. They need to pay back the money. PwC on Eskom definitely need to pay back the money. They've been asked to pay it back. As far as I know, they haven't agreed to pay it back. T-Systems, that's possibly one of the bigger ones and one of the companies that has just sailed under the radar. They need to pay back. Dentons, from your colleague Jessica Bezadenhout's reporting this week, we know that Dentons was also paying money into letterbox companies. Dentons needs to pay back too. Bain, Pauli can tell you all about Bain and why Bain needs to pay back money. The biggest one, though, is CRRC, which was the kind of merger between China North and China South Rail. These are the companies that got massively inflated locomotive contracts in order to allow, I think, I forget the final figure, I think it was around 9 billion rand in kickbacks to flow to, companies controlled by Salim Essa in Hong Kong. Those are going to be difficult ones because although the paper trail is clear, although there's plenty of evidence against them, that's kind of a company that's effectively state owned by the Chinese state. We're going to need guts to actually go and knock on China's door and say, sorry, but actually we'd like our money back. And while you're at it, we'd like you to prosecute or hand over so that we can prosecute the people involved. So in terms of accountability, it's a great first step that McKinsey has paid back the money. But there's a long way to go. There's a lot of companies that are on my list that need to pay back the money. KPMG, that's the closure that we've seen so far, which is, don't worry, we did an internal investigation, or we hired these lawyers, they did an investigation, and trust us, they say there's nothing to worry about. We need real accountability, we need real disclosure, we need real transparency, and we need the money back.
Fantastic. I hope someone was taking notes of Susan's shit list, because they are in big trouble. It only remains to thank Pauli, to thank Susan, and to thank most of all you insiders for your fantastic support of journalism at a time when we really need it more than ever. We can barely express how grateful we are for your continuing support. Thank you so much. And to everyone else, enjoy the rest of your evening. See you soon.
That's nice.